For 85 years, historians and enthusiasts have debated which was the best fighter in the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire or the Me109. Many of them talk absolute nonsense and miss the real differences entirely. The Wingleader team decided it was time to set the record straight.
You'll be surprised what we came up with. One of the biggest misconceptions in the Spitfire versus 109 debate is the firepower.
Every historian claims that the 109 had a much more powerful armament thanks to his two 20mm cannons in the wings. What they don't tell you is that for the first half of the Battle of Britain at least, only half the 109s had these cannons. The E1 version, which formed half of the Me109 force at the beginning of the battle, only had 4 machine guns and no cannons, so half the firepower of the Spitfire. Both aircraft carried a similar amount of ammunition, around 3,000 rounds, so the 109 could fire for longer, but the Spitfire had a greater weight of fire, which probably favoured the more inexperienced pilot. Another point to consider is that 2 of the 109's guns were mounted over the engine and fired through the propeller arc, which slowed the rate of fire. Incredibly, by the middle of the Battle of Britain, the lightly armed 109E1 was still in widespread use. On the 31st of August 1940, a day in which a lot of 109s were shot down over England, 9 E1s were shot down against just 7 cannon-armed versions. Of course, the later versions of the 109, from the E3 onwards, had the 2 machine guns in the wings replaced by slow-firing 20mm cannons, which did indeed outgun the Spitfire considerably. But even then, these early cannons had a low muzzle velocity and a slow rate of fire, which simply meant that they were very difficult to aim, as the cannon shells would drop below the target, especially in a tight turn. Another myth regarding armament is that the Battle of Britain Me109 had a cannon firing through the propeller spinner. This is nonsense. It was designed that way, but had a lot of technical problems, and so it wasn't introduced until the F-Series in late 1940.
So overall, if you were an expert pilot and if you had access to a cannon-armed Me109, you'd choose that. However, if you were just an average pilot, like most Battle of Britain pilots were, then really the Spitfire was the plane for you. Now, before we come to our next point, we really need to thank our sponsors War Thunder, who have made this longer film possible. War Thunder is a large, free-to-play, multiplayer war game that puts you in the middle of some remarkably diverse battles. You can drive tanks, sail warships and fly aircraft, including of course the Spitfire and the Me109. What sets War Thunder apart is its scale and level of authenticity. You can lead an armoured assault, fly a ground attack helicopter or fast jets, all on the same battlefield. The attention to detail is genuinely impressive. The aircraft don't just look accurate, they actually behave like the real thing. A well-placed shot can disable an engine, blow a wing off, or just cause an oil leak. And the technology available is extensive. You've got things like guided missiles, smoke screens, drones, and you know what, if you're having a really bad day at work, you've even got the option to unleash a tactical nuclear strike. You never used to get that with Space Invaders. The recently released update, Tusk Force, brings with it several new additions, notably the BM Oplot T tank, the Buck M3 sound system and the CF-188 Hornet. Classic maps such as Poland and Eastern Europe have also been thoroughly reworked. They've also improved all the graphics and have incorporated some more dynamic destruction and explosion physics. You can download War Thunder for free by using the link in the description. All new players and those who haven't played War Thunder for half a year or more will receive some special bonuses. 100,000 Silver Lions, a special Decorator Eagle of Valor, whatever that is, and much, much more. You can also play War Thunder Mobile for free on iOS and Android. Again, download using the link in the description below. So genuine thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this longer video. Now let's get back to myth 2. People always say that the Spitfire had a much better canopy than the 109, but we beg to disagree.
Now, contrary to what some historians tell you, the Spitfire canopy was not a bubble or blown canopy during the Battle of Britain. It was totally flat-sided with just a bulge on the top to accommodate the taller pilots, so visibility was very limited behind. The fully blown canopy was only introduced on the Mark V a year or so later. Another serious problem with the Spitfire Mark I Canopy was that it couldn't be jettisoned in an emergency. The hood slid back, which seemed to be a much better design than the 109's, which hinged to the side, and so was impossible to open in flight. However, if the Spitfire Canopy's sliding rail was damaged in any way, the pilot was trapped. So a single bullet hole in the rail could prevent the pilot from getting out of the cockpit completely without outside help. No chance of bailing out, no chance of escaping a ditching in the sea. They didn't even have the cockpit door crowbar until after the battle. Turning to the Me109 Canopy, the visibility was worse than the Spitfire due to the heavy framing, and it was equally as difficult to see behind the aircraft. Both the Spitfire and Me109 pilots mounted mirrors on the canopy to rectify this. However, the advantage of the 109's canopy was that you could jettison it when needed. In fact, the entire rear section was detachable, including the aerial mast.
So which had the better canopy? Well, let's be honest, both were pretty rubbish, weren't they? But I think we would choose the 109 simply because you could get rid of it. Wouldn't you?
It's generally accepted that the Spitfire could turn inside the Me109, and most performance figures seem to bear this out. However, there's more to it than that. Turning dogfights were not common in the battle, as no fighter pilot wants to fight in that way. But if they did get into a turning dogfight, the Spitfire as an aircraft could indeed turn tighter. But the 109 pilot had two cards up his sleeve. Firstly, he had leading-edge slats on his wings, which essentially delayed the stall of the wing. This enabled him to pull tighter before the airflow departed the surface of the wing, causing it to stall. His second card was that he sat lower in his cockpit than the Spitfire pilot. His racing driver posture therefore enabled him to pull a bit more G before blacking out. The Spitfire pilot sat in a more conventional sitting position, which meant that the blood would drain from the upper part of his body much faster in a tight turn.
So if you got into a turning fight in the real world, then the differences between the two aircraft were so small that the advantage could be gained by either pilot.
Much is made of the Me109 having fuel injection, but did it really make a big difference? The Me109's DB601 engine had fuel injection. This gave the 109 pilot a slight, if not rather uncomfortable, advantage, as he could bunt downwards if he had a Spitfire on his tail. However, the Spitfire pilot soon learned to roll inverted and pull positive G to follow the 109 in a dive, which is a more natural maneuver anyway. This feature has led many historians to claim that the Me109 was faster in the dive, when in actual fact it was simply faster into the dive. So basically both aircraft could dive equally as fast. The decisive factor in a dive was which one would shed its wings first when pulling out. Both fighters could be overstressed by pulling too tightly on the control column at high speeds, the Spitfire especially. The oxygen system is not something generally talked about when comparing the two aircraft, but in the second half of the battle it became more important as the combats got higher and higher. We asked Ian, our technical expert, to have a look into it.
Well, the problem with the RAF oxygen system in 1940 was it just wasn't very efficient. The pilot had one oxygen bottle beside him. When he turned that on, it started to squirt oxygen down the hose, and it didn't stop. It went to a regulator on the instrument panel, and then to his D-type oxygen mask. The oxygen mask was made of canvas effectively and chamois leather, so it wasn't a terribly good fit. The tube was facing straight into it and it just kept spraying oxygen. So he would run out fairly quickly. Although he could regulate the flow, he couldn't stop the flow. Well, the German system was better because they had a similar amount of oxygen in the tank, but it was going through a regulator. On the pilot's right-hand side, there was a Draeger oxygen regulator, and that meant when he breathed in, he got oxygen. When he didn't need oxygen, it didn't supply it, unlike the British system, which was just squirting oxygen out the whole time. They were also helped by the fact that the Germans had a rubber oxygen mask, which fitted the face tightly, and the Germans did like some tight-fitting rubber. And that meant they weren't losing oxygen out the side of the mask. Well, another failing of the RAF oxygen system was because of the constant delivery, the oxygen never stopped, and oxygen being very, very flammable, it could explode. And there was one very unfortunate pilot officer, Grubby Grice, and his oxygen mask caught fire. it basically blew up off his face and blew off his goggles.
The 109 carried twice the amount of oxygen, 2 750-litre aluminium tanks, and delivered it in such a more efficient way that the 109 pilot had effectively 4 times the oxygen endurance than the Spitfire pilot. This was crucial in October in allowing the 109 force to get to 30,000 feet over France and remain there for the entire sweep over the south of England and London. RAF Spitfire pilots had to be mindful of their oxygen situation, and there are many combat reports and casualty files that refer to oxygen starvation during the course of a patrol.
Now, of course, altitude is key in any fighter versus fighter combat, and the fact that the 109 could arrive at great height over England and stay there throughout the combat gave it a huge advantage over the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain.
Precise information about the use of self-sealing fuel tanks is hard to find for both aircraft, even in official documents. However, the crucial difference was that the Spitfire pilot had all of his fuel in front of him, whereas the only 109 pilot had all of his fuel underneath or behind him. This fundamental difference in design meant quite simply that if the fuel tank burst into flames, the Spitfire pilot would be badly burned, whereas the 109 pilot would hardly be touched at all. It's a fact that there are very few records of 109 pilots needing treatment for burns during the Battle of Britain. Sadly, the same cannot be said for Spitfire and Hurricane pilots. So the Wingleader team had reached their conclusion. Both aircraft had their advantages and disadvantages, and their performance was actually very similar. But which was the best?
Well, I think by then, for me, the 109 had forged ahead. It had better cannons, it could carry bombs, it even had a dinghy in the cockpit in case you ditched in the sea. But you see, by then it was too late. The Battle of Britain was over, the invasion had been postponed, and the Spitfire designers were already fixing the faults that we've highlighted here. And it's also worth pointing out that even in late October 1940, right at the end of the battle, there were still lightly armed E1s operating over England, like this one, White 13, shot down on the 27th of October at Lydd in Kent. History is never black and white.
On the 28th of November 1940, 2 great aces met in the sky off the Isle of Wight. John Dundas of 609 Squadron had flown Spitfires throughout the Battle of Britain, claiming a dozen victories along the way. Helmut Vick had claimed double the amount, flying the 109. They were both expert pilots. They knew how to get the best out of their respective aircraft and were battle-hardened and full of confidence. Neither of them returned from that combat.
Now, we'll never know what actually happened that day, and we'll never know whether the advantages and disadvantages of either aircraft were a factor in their loss. But it probably emphasises the fact that luck or a momentary lapse of concentration probably had more of a decisive effect on the outcome of a dogfight than anything we've mentioned here today.